Welcome to Peninsula Seniors Lecture Series.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another of the Wednesday morning lecture programs brought to you by the Peninsula Seniors here in Rancho Palos Verdes. Today, we are going to relive history. I've impressed upon our speaker to return to us now, Madam Golda Meir, the former Prime Minister of the State of Israel, will be brought to us by historic impersonator Mr. Peter Small.
Does my smoking bother you? I was 71 when I was elected prime minister. I was 76 when I retired. Are you afraid I'm not going to live to be an old lady? You know, David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, was supposed to have said about me that I was the only man in his cabinet. I don't know how that story ever got started, because I don't think the ministers in my government would be flattered if I said they were the only women in my cabinet. I recall in 1973, when I was prime minister, I had an audience with His Holiness Pope Paul VI in Vatican City. And this was the first time that the head of any Israeli government had such an audience with the pontiff. And as I was walking through the Vatican with my aides, I thought to myself, you know, here I am, the daughter of a mere carpenter from Russia, going to meet the head of all the world's Catholics. Well, one of my aides put me at ease, and he said, "Don't worry, Golda. Carpentry's a very popular profession around here." But when I came face to face with the Pope, he expressed his concern about what he called our harsh treatment of the Arabs in what he called the occupied territories. These were the areas that we had won during the Six-Day War of June 1967, the Sinai Peninsula, but more specifically the Gaza Strip, Judea and Samaria on the west bank of the Jordan, and the Golan Heights. And he could not understand a people who had been persecuted for so long, how we could treat others so harshly. I looked at him and I said, "Harshness? Your Holiness, let me tell you something about harshness. Do you know what my first memories were? They were, as a young girl in Russia, of my father getting ready to protect our home against Cossacks, screaming, 'Kill the Jews.' Oh, and by the way, we don't need any more lessons about harshness, because we learned a lot about mercy when we were led to the gas chambers by the Nazis. If my life is to have any meaning at all, it is to save Jewish children from a similar fate." Well, as I mentioned to you, I was born in Russia. My earliest memories of life in Russia were of fear and hunger, fear of pogroms and never having enough to eat. Now, my father, Moshe Yitzchak Meibovich, was a very skilled carpenter, but in anti-Semitic Russia, he could barely find enough work not just to support himself, but my mother Bluma, my sister Shana, me, and my youngest sister Tzipki. I mean, we were so poor, I had to share gruel, which was an excuse for hot cereal, with my youngest sister, Tzipki. But my father did what many Jews of his generation in Russia did. He came to America for a better life. He made his way to Milwaukee in Wisconsin, and after 2 years, he was able to save up enough money to send for my mother, my two sisters, and me, and we arrived here in the United States in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1906, when I was just 8 years old. And we knew that life in America was going to be so much different and so much better than it was in Russia. Yes, we were living in a poor immigrant neighborhood, but we had enough to eat. I had new clothing. I was able to go to school. But to show you the differences between life in America and Russia, I remember it was a Labor Day parade, and my father was marching with his labor union. On either side of him were policemen accompanying them on horseback. Well, my youngest sister, Tzipki, became frightened. You see, in Russia, a man on horseback was to be feared. Here in America, he was there to protect us. And as I mentioned to you, I was able to go to school. Now, at that time, we did not get free textbooks. We had to purchase them. Well, the problem was many of us were too poor and too proud to admit that we could not afford textbooks. So at the age of 10 in the 4th grade, I began my first political activity. I organized a group of classmates into what we called the Young Sister Society of America. We held a fundraiser. We read poems. We gave speeches. I gave one of my first speeches, and I remember at the time people said to me, "Goldie, you ought to write down what you're going to say." But I always find the best speeches I give are the ones that come right from the heart. Back then, my mother was already calling me a kochleffel, which in Yiddish means a stirring spoon. I was always stirring up things. As I grew into adolescence, just like teenagers today, I went through my period of rebellion. My parents wanted me to settle down, get married. But, well, I did want to eventually get married, but not yet. I wanted to finish high school, go on to college, become a teacher. So I rebelled against my parents and I ran away from home. I ran away to Denver, Colorado. That's where my older sister Shana was living with her future husband Shemai Korngold. I moved in with them, went to school during the day, helped them out in their business after school. But at night their home was a social center for many Jewish immigrants in Denver. It was also in my sister's home that I had my first true exposure to politics. Well, I should explain, when I was growing up, the true political activist in our family was not me, but my older sister Shana. Even as a teenager in Russia, she was already involved with revolutionary activities, which, of course, frightened my parents, who were afraid that she might be arrested by the Tsarist police, which fortunately never happened. But it was in my sister's home I was exposed to many ideas. And there were two in particular that made the greatest impact on me. They were socialism and Zionism. Now, when I talk about socialism, I'm talking about the ideas that the workers share in the means of production. They benefit from its profits. There would be decent wages, good working conditions for the workers, cradle-to-grave health insurance for workers and their family, old age pensions for retired workers, and daycare for those working women who needed it. The other was the idea of Zionism, that we Jews should return to Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, the Holy Land, or at that time known as Palestine. Restore the land and ourselves as a free nation and free people like the other nations of the world. As I also mentioned to you, my sister and brother-in-law's home was also a social center for many Jews in that area, and I got to know and become very well acquainted with many of them. Well, there was one man in particular. He was a sign painter by the name of Morris Meyerson. Well, Morris began to eventually ask me to accompany him to lectures, concerts, picnics. I guess back then we would have called it courting. And eventually we fell in love. But by now I had reconciled with my parents, returned to Milwaukee, where I graduated at the top of my high school class at North Division High School. And then I entered the Milwaukee Normal School, where I graduated which today, by the way, is the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. I graduated from there and taught for 2 years in a local Volksschule, which is a Yiddish language or cultural school. In the meantime, Morris had followed me back to Milwaukee, and he asked me to marry him. And I agreed to do so. And we were married in December of 1917. Now, 1917 was a very important year in the history of the world. The United States entered World War I on the side of the Allies. Revolution had broken out in Russia. British troops under General Allenby had invaded Palestine, liberated it from Turkish rule. And in December of 1917, Great Britain issued the Balfour Declaration, which stated that His Majesty's government recognized the right of the Jewish people to a national home in Palestine, the first time any nation so recognized our right to do so. These were very exciting times. I became involved with a labor Zionist group called Poeli Zion, means the workers of Zion. I was involved with giving speeches on street corners, raising funds, marching in parades. I recall one parade I was marching in. We were protesting a pogrom in Russia. Despite their revolution, Russia still was not and still is not a safe place for Jews. But as I was marching in this parade, I thought to myself, the answer to pogroms, the answer to anti-Semitism is not parades, but to go to Palestine, to immigrate to Palestine, or as we say in Hebrew, to make aliyah to Eretz Yisrael. Only then will we have our own Jewish national home. And from that point on, I knew there was no other choice but to go to Palestine. Well, the problem is I had to convince Morris. Well, he was really more of an internationalist than he was a Zionist. But after about 3 years, I managed to organize a group of us, and we were ready to set sail for Palestine in the summer of 1921. Even at the last minute, my older sister Shana and brother-in-law Shammai joined us. Well, what should have been a 2-week voyage to Palestine took us nearly 6 weeks. Oh, conditions aboard that ship, the SS Pocahontas, were so... That was the name of it. They were so terrible, even the crew mutinied. But eventually we disembarked in Palestine, in Jaffa, on the Mediterranean coast. And when we arrived there and disembarked there, it wasn't a question of trying it. We knew this was it. We knew life ahead was going to be difficult, it was going to be hard, nobody promised us anything, and we didn't expect anything. And life would be difficult. Well, when we arrived in Jaffa, we decided to settle in a new Jewish settlement that was being built outside of Jaffa, right next door to Jaffa. It was about 12 years, this Jewish settlement was about 12 years old, and its name roughly translates from the Hebrew into English as Hill of Spring. I think all of you recognize it by its Hebrew name, Tel Aviv. Morris got a job as a bookkeeper, I tutoring English. But that's not why we made Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael. That's not why we immigrated to Palestine. We immigrated there to become what we call in Hebrew chalutzim, pioneers. We wanted to till the soil and make the land green again. So we applied for membership in a kibbutz. Now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the kibbutz, or in the plural, the kibbutzim in Israel. They are collective settlements where all property is jointly owned by its membership. Well, Morris and I had applied for membership in one kibbutz. It had been formed up in northern Palestine in the Jezreel Valley. Its name is Merchavia. Today it's located near the town of Afula. Well, the members of Merchavia were these hardy chalutzim, hardy pioneers who had come out of the ghettos and shtetls and the villages and the poverty of Eastern Europe. And they were used to a hard, difficult life. And they were reluctant about accepting us Americans. Well, you know, Americans are supposed to be soft and spoiled and not be able to take a hard, difficult life. Well, reluctantly, they agreed to accept us as members, and yes, life on the kibbutz was hard. We lived in tents and shacks. We had to drain the swamps, till the soil. I even worked in a chicken coop, and we really became ingrained in the life of the kibbutz. So much so that one day they asked me to represent them at a meeting of the kibbutzim that was going to be held in Degania. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever traveled to Israel, but Degania was the first kibbutz established in Israel. It's on the shores of what we call in Israel Lake Kinneret, or you know as the Sea of Galilee. Well, I was very honored to represent my kibbutz at such an important meeting, but I was, very hesitant and reluctant to go. Well, I didn't speak Hebrew very well at the time, and I told them that. And they said, never mind, Goldie, go there, listen, come back, and give us a report. Well, I went, I attended the meeting, and when it came time for me to give a report from Kibbutz Merchavia, since I was not comfortable or good enough in Hebrew, I decided to speak a language that we all had in common, the common language of the Jews of Eastern Europe, Yiddish. You know what I heard? Ivrit, 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 Dabri Ivrit, Dabri Ivrit. Hebrew, speak Hebrew. Well, I have to tell you, and I'll tell you this first in Hebrew. Lamanati ek ledaber Ivrit aval afilu hayom ani medaberet Ivrit imifta Amerikait chazaka. I think a few of you may understand me. What I said was, I learned how to speak Hebrew, but I still speak it today with a heavy American accent. Like any young couple, Morris and I wanted to raise a family and have children. But child raising on the kibbutz at that time was done collectively. The children were raised in a children's house, and child raising decisions were not made by the parents, but by a committee of the kibbutz, which would be ratified by a vote of the membership of the kibbutz. Well, Morris didn't want a committee to decide how our children were going to be raised. So very reluctantly, I followed Morris out of the kibbutz. We settled in Jerusalem, where we got jobs with a fledgling construction firm called Sole Boneh, which today is one of the major construction firms in Israel. At that time, it was one of several cooperative firms that was being started up by a new organization in Palestine that was called in Hebrew Histadrut Klalit Ovdei Eretz Yisrael, the General Federation of Labor of Israel, or now is just commonly known as the Histadrut. Its Secretary General at the time was a young Polish Jew by the name of David Ben-Gurion. Well, Morris and I got jobs with Sole Boneh, he as a bookkeeper, I as a clerk. The problem was, though, because it was a new firm, we weren't always paid in cash or in Palestinian pounds or pound sterling. Many times we were paid in scrip, which wasn't always respected or received by the local merchants. I even had to do laundry in a nursery just to make ends meet for our family. It was also during this time that my two children were born, my son Menachem and my daughter Sarah. It was also the worst 4 years of my life. Oh, it wasn't just the poverty we were living in. Well, Morris and I were drifting apart. We were really just two different people. He was more introverted, and I, of course, was more extroverted, more outgoing. I think he would have preferred a more traditional stay-at-home wife, but as you know, I was not to be that. We never divorced, although we did separate. But I will say this in his defense. He was the finest father my children could have had. As I will tell you about my rise through the ranks of the Zionist leadership, first in Palestine, later in the State of Israel, I wasn't always there for my children. He was. He introduced them to art, literature, music, culture when I wasn't there. In 1928, a major change came in my life, one of many. I was asked to become the Mazkira Moatzet Pe'elot, the secretary of the Women's Workers' Council of the Histadrut, the Labor Federation. It meant moving with my children to Tel Aviv, and of course to a better paying job. But this also marked the beginning of my rise through the ranks of the Zionist leadership, first in Palestine and later in the State of Israel. First through the ranks of the Histadrut, later the Jewish Agency, which represented the Jews to the British Mandate authorities in Palestine, and of course the government of the future State of Israel. And I became very well acquainted with many of the future leaders of Israel. David Ben-Gurion, of course, our first prime minister, Chaim Weizmann, our first president, and other men who were become not just colleagues of mine in government, but close personal friends. Levi Eshkol, our future prime minister, Zalman Shazar and Yitzhak Ben Zvi, the future presidents of Israel, Eliezer Kaplan and Pinchas Sapir, the future finance ministers of Israel, men who were to become close personal friends who would come and socialize and have tea and cake in my apartment. But it wasn't easy being a single mother. Oh, yes, I had my sister Shana or friends look after the children during the daytime. But I remember one incident. I think Menachem was about 6 and Sarah was 4, and it was already evening, and I hadn't returned home from work yet. And they were asking themselves, Eifo Ima, Eifo Ima, where's Mama, where's Mama? Well, they made their way to the Histadrut building just a few blocks from our apartment where I was conducting a meeting. And we were discussing and voting on an issue. I don't even remember what the issue was. But when it came time to a vote, I said, all those in favor, raise your hands and say aye. There was Sarah and Menachem in the back raising their hands. It was the greatest vote of confidence I ever received. 1933 saw the rise of Hitler to power in Germany, and he immediately began his persecution of the Jewish people throughout Germany. We in Palestine began to receive an influx of what we call in Hebrew Olim Chadashim, new immigrants coming in from Germany. By 1939, Hitler had rearmed Germany, and it appeared that Europe was on the brink of war. Now, Great Britain knew in case of a war with Nazi Germany, they could rely upon the loyalty of the Jews of Palestine. But the problem was they couldn't rely upon the loyalty of the Arabs of Palestine or of the Middle East. So in March of 1939, in order to appease and placate the Arabs of Palestine and the Middle East, Great Britain issued a white paper. First of all, it restricted and limited the sales and purchase to and the purchase by Jews of land in Palestine. Worse, it limited Jewish immigration to Palestine. Only 75,000 Jews would be admitted to Palestine over a 5-year period. And after that, all Jewish immigration would cease. At a time that our people faced their greatest danger, the gates of hope were now closed. I remember Ben-Gurion said at the time, we would fight the white paper as if there was no war, and we would fight the war as if there was no white paper. Well, 1939 saw war with Nazi Germany. 1945 saw its final defeat. And I know I don't have to explain to anyone in this room what happened to 6 million of our fellow Jews in the concentration camps and gas chambers of Nazi-occupied Europe. Those who survived were now living in displaced person camps. They did not want to remain in the continent that had seen their families, their lives, their communities, and their hopes destroyed. They wanted to come to Palestine. Unfortunately, the British white paper was still in effect, and any attempts by our own self-defense group, the Haganah, to smuggle in refugees or Jewish immigrants to Palestine, if they were caught off the coast of Palestine by the Royal Navy, they were sent back to detention camps on Cyprus, again behind barbed wire. Well, despite this, a few Jews were still being allowed in each month under white paper quotas. And there was one group of detainees in one of these camps who were scheduled to be released. Well, we at the Jewish Agency, of which I was now a member of its administration, we had decided that it was more important to let the children out first. They were our hope, our future. Their spirits hadn't been broken by the war. So I was sent to this one camp in Cyprus to negotiate not just with the camp commandant, but with the Jews in the camp to let the children out first. And I remember when I arrived at the camp, the commandant had already been warned by the High Commissioner's office in Jerusalem. Be aware of Mrs. Meyerson. She's formidable. And when I was greeted by the detainees in the camp, the children greeted me with a bouquet of flowers. Now, I have to tell you something. I've received many bouquets of flowers throughout my public career, but this one was the most heart-touching and sentimental one I'd ever received. You see, the flowers the children gave me were made out of paper. And I realized these are the children who survived the ghettos and concentration camps of Nazi Europe, and I wondered if they'd ever seen a real flower before. Well, I convinced the detainees to let the children out of the camp, and they made their way to Palestine. Now, 1946 and 1947 saw a great rise in agitation against British rule in Palestine. Not just sabotage activities by our own self-defense group, the Haganah, but I'm very sorry to tell you, terrorist activities committed by rival underground groups such as the Stern Gang and the Irgun. And I want to say this now, I have no use for terrorism. I don't care if it comes from Jews or Arabs. But life became so unbearable and the situation became so unbearable for the British in Palestine, they decided to turn the entire question over to the United Nations. They set up a special commission to investigate Palestine and made their recommendations to the United Nations General Assembly, which were adopted on November 29, 1947. And they followed a very similar plan that had been done in India several months earlier. The plan was to partition Palestine into two states, Jewish and Arab. Now, the partition lines that were adopted weren't exactly what we wanted. I mean, Jerusalem was to be internationalized. Northern Palestine and Nazareth was to be part of this Arab state. Beersheba was to be part of the Arab state. And the Arabs were to have a coastal strip going from Gaza all the way up towards Jaffa. But at least we were going to have our own independent state. Unfortunately, it was rejected outright by the Arabs of Palestine and the Arab nations of the Middle East. The Arab nations announced that once the British left in mid-May of 1948, they would invade our new state and push us into the sea. We were ready to fight for our independence and our liberation. We already had arms agents in Europe ready to purchase the weapons that we would need to fight and win our war of liberation that would come the following spring and summer. The problem was, we didn't have a standing government yet. We weren't an independent nation. We couldn't appropriate the funds that we would need to purchase those weapons. There was only one place we could go to get the funds that we would need to buy those vital weapons. It would be from the Jews of the United States. Now, by now, I was a member of what was called in Hebrew the Va'adat Le'umi, the National Council of what would be the future government of the State of Israel. And I remember Ben-Gurion himself was ready to take the first flight to New York to go to the United States and raise those funds. And I want to tell you something about Ben-Gurion. On many issues, especially the major issues, he was usually right. This time, I overruled him. I said to him, Ben-Gurion, what you can do in Palestine, I can't do. But what you're going to do in the United States, I can do. And a majority of the council agreed. They said, yes, Ben-Gurion, send Golda. She grew up in the United States. She knows how the American Jews think and feel. She speaks their language. So they immediately sent me on the first flight to New York. I didn't even have time to return to my apartment in Jerusalem for a change of clothes. I had whatever I was wearing and carried the equivalent of about $10 in my pocketbook. Well, after I arrived in New York, I rested at the home of my youngest sister, Tzipke. She's known by her American name, Clara Stern. She lives in Bridgeport, Connecticut. But from there, I made my way to Chicago to meet with the Jewish federations. Now, I had traveled to the United States many times before, but when I did, I usually met with labor Zionist groups. I never dealt with the Jewish federations because at that time they were non-Zionist and concerned understandably with their own local institutions and charities. But they had all gathered in Chicago to hear what I had to say, and I told them something like this. You cannot decide whether we will fight the Mufti or not. We have made that decision. But you can decide whether we are going to be victorious or not. It's not a question of whether we lose another 700,000 Jews in Palestine. We just lost 6 million of our people in the last war. And to be worried about another 700,000 Jews would be audacious on my part. But if these 700,000 Jews are lost, then our chances to be a free nation and a free people will be lost forever. The nations of Egypt, Transjordan, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon have standing governments with standing armies who can appropriate the funds that they need to supply and equip their soldiers. We don't even have a standing government yet, and no nation would ask its young men to go out and defend their homeland if it couldn't give them the supplies and weapons that they would need to defend it. This is a decision that you have to make tonight, or at least in the next few days. Don't put it off for a few weeks or a few months, because by then it will be too late. When I finished speaking, there was silence, then there was applause. I raised nearly $20 million that night, which we sent immediately to our arms agents in Europe to purchase the weapons that we would need to fight and win our war of liberation and independence that would come the following spring and summer. Eventually, I raised nearly $50 million that went to our arms agents to purchase those weapons. When I returned to Tel Aviv, Ben-Gurion said to me, When Jewish history is written, it will be because of a Jewish woman that the Jewish nation was founded. It was now May 1948. The British mandate would end in a few days, and we would be ready to declare our independence, and we were ready to fight for it. But we were also looking for every single hope of peace with our neighbors. 30 years later, we're still looking for every hope of peace with our neighbors. Well, there was one slight hope of peace, and that was with Transjordan. We had actually had good relations with its king, King Abdullah. Oh, he's the grandfather of King Hussein of Jordan. And we had actually had a meeting with him in December of 1947, right after the partition vote. It was a secret meeting we held at the border between Transjordan and Palestine at the Jordan River. And he had pledged to us at that time that he would not attack and invade us. But already we could see that it was not to be. Iraqi troops were already mobilizing inside Transjordan. And you see, it was very important to keep Transjordan out of the war, because by doing that, we could prevent Iraqi troops from moving through and attacking us. But more importantly, we could keep the Arab Legion out of Transjordan out of the war. The Arab Legion was the best trained army in the Arab world. It was led and trained by British officers under John Glubb. And if we could keep them out, we could keep Jerusalem and our Central Front safe. But we could already see that it was not to be. As I mentioned, the Iraqi troops were already mobilizing and maneuvering inside Transjordan, and the Arab Legion was mobilizing. And if Abdullah was to meet with us, he wouldn't even come halfway. We would have to go all the way to meet him. And I was chosen to do so. Well, the problem is I couldn't go like this, all dressed and announced. I had to go in secret. So I went up to Haifa to have a disguise made. I would go disguised as a traditional Arab woman with a hood and a veil and a long robe. Well, I have another problem. I don't speak Arabic. I have an aide who does, Ezra Dannon, and he would pose as my husband, which is good, because in the Arab world, a man will not speak to a strange woman who is not his wife. We had to change cars several times, go through many military roadblocks, but eventually we made our way to the royal palace in Amman. And when I confronted the king, I said to him, "Have you broken your promise to us?" He then told me, "When I met you in December, I stood alone. Now I am one of 5. And I knew he meant the other nations that were ready to invade us. And then I said to him, "Don't you know we're the only friends you have in this region?" He said to me, "Yes, I know you are. And I believe that Allah sent you here to bring us the benefits of Western civilization. And after all, we both have a common enemy in the Mufti. But why don't you let me come in with my army, annex Palestine, and I can guarantee you representation in my parliament?" I thought to myself, what does this man want, the throne of King David? And then I'll never forget this. Then he asked me, "Why are you people in such a hurry to declare a state?" I told him, "We have waited 2,000 years. I don't think we're in such a hurry." It was obvious he was going to join in the attack. I made my way back to Tel Aviv to tell Ben Gurion the news. It was now Friday, May 14th, 1948. The British mandate would end at midnight Saturday. But as many of you know, the Jewish Sabbath, which is on Saturday, actually begins at sundown on Friday night. Well, all our holidays and major celebrations always begin at sundown the night before. So in order not to violate the Jewish Sabbath, we decided to hold our Declaration of Independence ceremony late that Friday afternoon. We held it in Tel Aviv at the Tel Aviv Museum over on Rothschild Boulevard. It was there that Ben Gurion read our Declaration of Independence. Shekayam be'eretz Yisrael, Medinat Yisrael. Now exists in the land of Israel, the state of Israel. I was among those called up to sign the Declaration of Independence, and I remember the emotion that came over me. It wasn't just the emotion of this historic moment, but there were so many other people in our movement who should have been signing this instead of me, but did not live to see this day. I can think of someone like Burl Katzenelson. He was the editor of the Labor Party newspaper Devar, a close personal friend of Ben Gurion, or Eliyahu Golab, the first commander of our self-defense group, the Haganah. If these people were alive, they would have been signing it instead of me. And now here I was, Golda Meir signing a Declaration of Independence. And as I was signing it, I remembered my lessons as a schoolgirl in Milwaukee. And I thought about people like, and I thought back to my lessons learning about the American Declaration of Independence. And I thought of people like Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin. I thought, what geniuses those men were. And now here I am, Golda Meir signing a Declaration of Independence. With this, our long exile would be over, and we would now be a free nation and free people like the other nations of the earth. Well, when the ceremony was over, I couldn't return to Jerusalem. It was already under siege by Arab forces. So that night, I stayed with friends in Tel Aviv. And that night, and that evening, we drank a toast to our new state. I couldn't do it with much enthusiasm because we knew an invasion would be coming the next day. But that night, we received some good news. We received word from Washington, D.C., 11 minutes after we declared independence. President Truman recognized our new state. The United States of America was the first nation in the world to recognize the new state of Israel and to welcome us into the family of nations. And it's been the beginning of a great friendship between both our nations, which is even stronger today. Well, war came, but my place was not in the new state. You see, among the other nations that quickly recognized our independence included the Soviet Union. So in the summer of 1948, I was appointed our first minister or diplomatic representative to the USSR. When I arrived in Moscow, I presented my credentials to the president of the Soviet Union. And I thought to myself, what a wonderful opportunity this was to reestablish contact with the Jews of the Soviet Union, or Elie Wiesel would call them the Jews of silence, with whom we had lost contact with since the revolution of 1917 and 1918. But as you know, the Soviet Union was a tightly controlled police state under the rule of Joseph Stalin. And not just were its own citizens closely watched, so were foreign diplomats and foreign visitors. And the Jews of the Soviet Union were openly warned by their government not to have any contact with us. Well, you know, no matter how hard you try, you can never kill the spirit of a people. I remember it was Yontif. It was the high holidays of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the new Jewish New Year and Day of Atonement of 1948, and I was going to attend services at the Great Synagogue in Moscow. And even in Stalin's time, they could expect even 1,000 or 2,000 people at the Great Synagogue on the high holidays. But when I arrived there, the synagogue was packed and crowded. I could barely make my way up into the balcony where the women sat. But when I did, when I was there, we davened, and when I was finished davening or praying and services were over, I went out into the streets. They were crowded with Moscow's Jews. They were showing their solidarity with the new state of Israel, and they were shouting, "Golda, Golda, Golda." Now, I have to tell you something. I'm not religious, but usually on the Sabbath and holidays, I try not to ride. Well, it was so crowded, they had to get a taxi to get me out of there. And before I got into the taxi, the crowd wanted me to say something, and I didn't know what to say, so I told them in Yiddish, "Thank you for having remained Jews." You know, they spread the word through the crowd like it was a great biblical prophecy. But we never forgot each other. More than 20 years later, there was a trickle, eventually a small flow through the Iron Curtain of Olim Chadashim, of new immigrants coming from the Soviet Union to the State of Israel. And as Prime Minister, I had the honor of welcoming many of these new immigrants to their new homes in the State of Israel. And many of them said to me, "I remember when you came to the great shul on Yontif. I remember when you came to the great synagogue on the high holidays." And others had saved yellowed newspaper clippings of when I presented my credentials to the President of the Soviet Union. We had not forgotten each other, and now we were reunited in our ancient homeland. Well, after a year of service in Moscow, I was recalled to Jerusalem, where Ben-Gurion appointed me Minister of Labor. And I was to spend the next 7 years as Minister of Labor. And I have to tell you, of any years of my public service, these were my most satisfying years and happiest years. Now, they were difficult times in Israel because we were trying to absorb hundreds of thousands of new immigrants, not just from the displaced person camps of Europe, not just Holocaust survivors, but hundreds of thousands of Jews who had been living for centuries in Arab countries who were now living in danger. Now, when they arrived in Israel, we didn't have much for them. Many cases, all we had were what we called in Hebrew, mabarot, transit camps. And all we had for them in many cases were just tents and shacks. But as Minister of Labor, I saw to it that we built new apartments, new factories, even new towns and cities to give these people new homes, new jobs, to integrate them and to absorb them into our society. I don't know why the Arabs never did the same with their refugee problem. In 1956, Ben-Gurion appointed me Minister of Foreign Relations for the State of Israel. He also made a ruling that all members of his cabinet were to have Hebrew names. So Golda Meir became Golda Meir. It's from the Hebrew word, it means light or shine, to illuminate. Well, 1956 was a critical year in Israel. Now, I know we're always living in critical times in Israel. Nasser had come to power several years earlier in Egypt. He nationalized the Suez Canal, forbid Israeli shipping to pass through in violation of international law. He blockaded Sharm el-Sheikh, effectively closing our southern port of Eilat, again in violation of international law. In the Gaza Strip, on our border with Egypt, he set up Fedayeen bases. Fedayeen in Arabic means commando. But these weren't commandos. These were terrorists infiltrating into Israel, murdering Israeli civilians. He made a military alliance with Jordan and Syria and threatened to push us into the sea. We decided to take action against this threat to our existence. So in late October of 1956, in cooperation with Britain and France, we mobilized our armed forces and sent them into the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip, effectively destroying the Egyptian terrorist and army bases, and we advanced all the way to the Suez Canal. Unfortunately, we were met with overwhelming international condemnation. An overwhelming vote by the United Nations, which included the Soviet Union and the United States, condemned our actions. And so we were forced to give up our military gains. However, we were given international guarantees. A United Nations emergency force was placed at Sharm el-Sheikh, guaranteeing our right of free passage through the Straits of Tehran. And the same force was placed along our border with Egypt and in the Gaza Strip, guaranteeing the security of our borders. But I think many of you remember what happened to those international guarantees more than 10 years later. In May of 1967, Nasser sent his army into the Sinai Peninsula, told the United Nations to leave, which they did without a moment's hesitation. He mobilized the Arab world against us, and those are the events that led to the Six-Day War of June of 1967, which saw the overwhelming defeat of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. Well, by now, I was retired. I was an old lady. I wanted to spend more time with my 5 grandchildren. But in February of 1969, I had some very sad news. My good friend, the Prime Minister of Israel, Levi Eshkol, had died. And our ruling Labor Party, of which I was its Secretary General, well, we were facing elections for our Knesset, our parliament, later that year. And we needed someone to lead the party in those elections. Oh, don't worry, we had no shortage of candidates. We had 2 front runners, our Defense Minister Moshe Dayan and our Educational Minister Yigal Allon. But either of their candidacies would have split our party before a crucial national election. So we were looking for a temporary compromise candidate who could hold our party together during those elections. Well, I became that temporary compromise candidate, and that temporary candidacy lasted for more than 5 years. So in March of 1969, the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, elected me prime minister. Now, people have asked me, what is it like being a woman prime minister? I don't know. I was never a man prime minister before. You know, I really don't understand all of this talk about women's liberation. I never thought it anything special about being a woman. I remember on one of my trips here to the United States, I saw a poster with my face on it. And you know what it said? But can she type? I don't know. I never learned how to type. Look, the reason the president of Israel asked me to become prime minister wasn't because I was a woman, because he asked me because he felt and believed I had a majority in our parliament. Well, this was the situation when I became prime minister in March of 1969. Despite our overwhelming victory in the Six-Day War of 1967, we were met by the three no's of the Arab world. No negotiation, no recognition, no peace. The Soviet Union quickly rebuilt the armies of Egypt and Syria. The Palestine Liberation Organization began its war of terror against us, first from their bases in Jordan and later in Lebanon. And every time they attacked us, whether they bombed a market or a theater, attacked a school bus, hijacked an airplane, we retaliated strongly against their bases in Jordan and later in Lebanon. Yes, we got used to the usual chorus of international condemnation every time we defended ourselves, but I'd rather listen to that than suffer another Holocaust. But the problem we had was, before the Six-Day War, the main source of our military supplies was from France. And because we did not listen to or heed the advice of President de Gaulle by restraining ourselves before the war, he cut off all military supplies to us. There was only one place we could get the military supplies and weapons that we would need to defend ourselves in any future such conflict. It would be from the United States. And it meant building up an important relationship with the President of the United States, Richard Nixon. Now, let me tell you something. In a way, both our careers are parallel. We both became leaders of our nation in 1969, and yes, because of existing political conditions, we were both forced to resign in 1974. He was as much my American president as I was his Israeli prime minister. But we had many fruitful meetings over the years. I recall one meeting. I was flying to Washington, D.C. to meet with the president at the White House, and Foreign Minister Abba Eban accompanied me. You know, he was born in South Africa and grew up in England. And I remember when we met with President Nixon in the Oval Office, we met with the president and Henry Kissinger, who had now been elevated to Secretary of State. And I remember the president said to me at the time, "You know, Mrs. Meir, we both have something in common. We both have Jewish foreign secretaries." And I told him, "That is correct, Mr. President, but mine speaks English." But the president assured us in our meetings that there would be a balance of power in the Middle East. And I understood this to mean whatever the Arabs received from the Soviet Union, we could expect something from the United States. And eventually it came in the way of advanced fighter jets, F-4 and F-16, the Phantom and Skyhawk jets. That would become the mainstay of our defense. He also supported our hard line against terrorism. I remember after the American ambassador to the Sudan had been murdered by Palestinian terrorists in March of 1973, the president said to me, "You know, Mrs. Meir, we can never negotiate with these terrorists, never. You have to understand something. I grew up in a Quaker household. I was told to abhor capital punishment. But once we start negotiating with these terrorists, we will be endangering the lives of many innocent people in the future." So I knew we had a good, strong friend in the White House, and he was to prove that in October of 1973. Yes, we had received intelligence reports about a buildup of Egyptian forces along the Suez Canal, and Syrian forces along the Golan Heights. We had even mobilized our reserves in response to that in the spring of 1973, but it turned out to be a false alarm. But in late September and early October of 1973, I began to receive similar reports of an Egyptian and Syrian buildup along the ceasefire lines. And then I had received word that the Soviet military advisors had suddenly left Syria. The same thing happened in 1967, and I knew it meant one thing and one thing only: war. I met with the Chief of Staff of the Israel Defense Forces, Dado Elazar, and our Defense Minister, Moshe Dayan, on how we should meet this threat to our existence. Dayan said we should immediately reinforce the Golan Heights, and we sent an extra brigade there. Dado Elazar said we should have a preemptive airstrike like we did in 1967, hit the Egyptian and Syrian airfields first. But we had already been warned by Secretary of State Kissinger, if we were to fire the first shot in any new Middle Eastern war, we could not expect American aid. And we knew no matter who fired the first shot in any Middle Eastern war, the Arabs would receive help from the Soviet Union. And then I received a report that the Egyptian and Syrian attacks would come on Saturday, October 6, 1973 at 6 p.m., towards the end of Yom Kippur, the Jewish Day of Atonement, which many of you know is the holiest and most important day on the Jewish calendar. And even in Israel, where a majority of Israelis are not religious, the synagogues are packed and crowded on Yom Kippur. And even those who aren't in the synagogues praying, they're at home fasting. The streets are deserted of traffic. But I wasn't praying in the synagogue that day. I was in an emergency session with my cabinet trying to decide how we should meet this threat to our nation's existence. But before we could even decide, not at 6 p.m., at 2 p.m., sirens sounded all over Israel. War had come. It opened up with a massive Syrian offense against our troops in the Golan Heights, pushing us back towards the Galilee. The Egyptian army had crossed the Suez Canal and quickly established a bridgehead on the east bank of the canal. We mobilized our reserves, and I told the Israeli people that night that we would stop this act of madness and have victory. But for those first few days, we were barely holding off the Egyptian and Syrian attacks. And I wondered, where is the American aid? Where is the aid that President Nixon had promised us in case of war? I was personally ready to get on the first flight to Washington, D.C., go to the White House, and beg for those weapons. I remember calling up our ambassador to the United States, Simcha Dinitz, and I remember the conversation I had with him, and I remember what he said to me. But Golda, it's 3 a.m. in the morning here in Washington. I can't call Kissinger now. I told him, you call him now because tomorrow may be too late. Well, later that week, we saw the beginning of a massive American arms lift to Israel. And when those planes began to taxi with those supplies, those needed supplies at our international airport at Lod, it was the first time that I was to cry during that war, and it would not be the last. You see, the day that the American arms lift began was the same day we issued our first casualty lists. We had already lost more men than we did in 1967, and we would lose many, many more. But I knew I had made the right decision. Yes, by not attacking first, it did cost us many casualties. But now with this massive American arms lift, we would now turn the tide of war and save many more lives. Oh, and let me set the record straight about Richard Nixon. I know history will judge him very, very harshly, but he kept every single promise that he ever made to us. By the end of the first week, we had counterattacked and pushed the Syrians out of the Golan Heights, pushing them back towards Damascus, capturing Mount Hermon. By the second week, our forces broke through the Egyptian lines and crossed the Suez Canal. By the beginning of the third week, our forces had entered Suez City and surrounded the Egyptian Third Army. But by now, superpower politics came into play. Under pressure from the United States and the Soviet Union, a ceasefire was declared. At kilometer 101, the furthest point of our advance into Egypt, our officers met directly with Egyptian officers under the supervision of the United Nations. There, in face-to-face negotiations, we negotiated disengagement with Egypt, which was signed in January of 1973. It called for an exchange of prisoners and a withdrawal of our forces behind the east bank of the Suez Canal. Later, we would sign a similar agreement with Syria concerning the Golan Heights in the spring of 1974. But now my government was coming under immense criticism for not having the nation ready and prepared for war. And we had to face new elections for our Knesset, for our parliament, at the end of December of 1973. Despite the criticism and opposition, my government was reelected, and we organized and formed a new coalition government in the early winter of 1974. But criticism continued to mount. And finally, I decided it was time for this old lady to retire. So in April of 1974, I submitted my resignation as Prime Minister to the President of Israel. And our ruling Labor Party elected our first Sabra, or native Prime Minister. I think some of you may know that's what we call our native Israelis, the native-born Israelis. We call them Sabras. We named them after the prickly cactus pear. Tough and hard on the outside, soft and sweet on the inside, like our native Israelis. And the man we chose as our Prime Minister was our former ambassador to the United States, hero of the Six-Day War, and former Army Chief of Staff, Yitzhak Rabin, and as Defense Minister, Shimon Peres. They were part of a new generation who had grown up in the land of Israel, who never knew about pogroms or persecutions or ghettos. They'd grown up free in their own land of Israel, and now they were the ones who were going to face the future. And that's a question I've always had from people from abroad. They've always asked me, what about the future? Well, ever since I came to Israel more than 50 years ago, the question that we've had to face is not what about the future, which is the greatest danger. Will we ever have peace with the Arabs? Yes, I believe we will have peace with the Arabs, but peace will come only when there is a strong Israel. If there is not a strong Israel, there can never be any peace in the Middle East. Look, I can forgive the Arabs for killing our sons. It will be more difficult for me to forgive them for forcing us to kill their sons. And when they love their children more than they hate us, then we will have peace. But as I look back on my life, and I think back to the lessons I learned in Zionism as a young girl in Russia, to seeing not just my 2 children, but my 5 grandchildren growing up in their own state of Israel, that is what they expect, and that is what they should expect. I'd like to say to you, Toda Rabbah. Thank you very much. Shalom, Lehitraot. We'll see you.
Thank you for watching Peninsula Senior Lecture Series. I'm Betty Wheaton. See you next time.